Okay, well, following Alexander Vondra is always very difficult. It's kind of like going on stage after the Beatles. I'd like to thank Zbigniew and Katarzyna for inviting me here to the forum and for putting me on such a great panel. It's not every day that you get to share a stage with gentlemen to the likes of those to my left. Immediately to my left is Borys Tarasyuk, the former foreign minister of Ukraine. To his left is Robert Pszczel, the man who had probably the toughest job in the world, the NATO representative in Moscow. To his left is Professor Przemysław Żurawski, please tell me I pronounced that correctly, of the University of Łódź. And to his left is a man whose courage is known to the whole world, the single vote against the annexation of Crimea in the Russian state Duma, Ilya Ponomarev. As I was thinking about how to frame this panel, it just dawned on me that we're assuming here, the title of the panel, the Russian challenge, the Russian gamble in Syria and Ukraine, assumes that these two things are related to each other. I mean, I intuitively think they are, but it got me thinking, how are they related to each other? And I think there's three different ways you can look at this as how these things are related to each other. In one sense, this could be a defensive move for Russia. Russia's making a defensive move. They are losing in Ukraine or have lost in Ukraine. This is the assumption behind this, is that they are losing in Ukraine or have lost in Ukraine. They're trying to change the subject, and at the same time trying to defend their last remaining ally in the Middle East, Bashar al-Assad. Now, the underlying assumption of this, if you look at it this way, is a Russia in decline. It's a Russia in decline. The second way to look at it is that Russia's intervention in Syria is a transactional move. It's transactional. Ukraine is in play. Russia's trying to create a bargaining chip in Syria that it can use to trade for what it really wants, which is a freer hand in Ukraine. It's a transactional move. And the third way to look at this is that it is an aspirational move. Looking at it this way assumes that Russia is winning, is ultimately going to get what it wants in Ukraine, is confident of this, and is moving on, marching on to the next battlefield, and that battlefield being Syria. This way of looking at it tends to look at Russia as a resurgent, ascendant Russia. So the way to get the ball rolling, I wanted to kind of ask each of our panelists, which of these three do you think it is? Is this a defensive move by a Russia in decline, a transactional move by a Russia that's essentially a regional power and a global spoiler, or is it an aspirational move by a Russia that is ascendant? And at least I'd like to ask Borys Tarasyuk, your country is on the front line of this, so I'd like you to start for us on that.
Thank you. Well, I have a different view on this issue, and I think that what Russia did and aggression of Russia against Georgia in 2008 and against Ukraine last year, this is a demonstration of a new Russia, which is claiming to have a special rights and privileges in the region, which is claiming to the outside global powers that this is a backyard of Russia. So this is one issue. Another issue, Syria is a different case. Both are directly and indirectly affecting European security. In Syria's case, Russia is trying, to my mind, to do a multiple job. First, to claim that Russia's interests are not only in its so-called near abroad, but beyond. And one of the examples is Syria. That Russia, like the former Soviet Union, is coming back as a global player in the Middle East. And the third, unlike in Ukraine, where Russia is trying to undermine the existing legitimate government and the state, In Syria, vice versa, Russia is trying to support a dictator against the people of Syria and causing serious problems which may directly affect European security through the migrants, thousands and thousands of migrants going to the countries of the European Union. So this is the way I see this situation.
So it sounds to me that you see a resurgent Russia then in this. If you pull it back to Georgia and you go from Georgia to Ukraine to Syria, we see an ascendant Russia, if you will, a Russia that's becoming more assertive and is able to flex its muscles in more places. What about that, Robert? Do you see a ascendant Russia, or do you agree with my scheme here, or do you add to it, like as Borys Tarasyuk did, of this is either a defensive move, a transactional move, or an aspirational move?
Well, it's a difficult question. I still think it's easier to try to answer that than to take forward your suggestion. You mentioned already the Beatles, right? It's the last session, so thinking of we all hold hands and start singing "All You Need Is Love," but the NATO defense minister in Antalya tried that, and it leaked when they sang, something about the world. And no, NATO officials should not go there. I think it's in a way three questions. I think probably the answer is yes to all three of them. Maybe Russian decline, I would not describe it, but Russia, which has structural problems, and Putin is always looking for transactional opportunities, that's for sure. Whether it's aspirational or just sort of expression of some, deep-seated desire, from the slogans that we all know, Russia getting up from its needs. But I think in there, if I would suggest something, is that there is a common thread, and it's to do with how Russia wants to be perceived. And again, whether it's Russia, as Russia, and I think Ilya can answer that question. Is it all the Russians? I have some doubts, to put it mildly, but the current person in power, he does want the country to be perceived as indeed strong, resurgent, to be able to make deals, and that's the element of pragmatism. And thirdly, more negatively, these adventures, because that's what they are, apart from obviously having negative consequences for, for the outside world, for the region, there is an element of sort of covering up for various deficiencies and to distract attention. So it's this famous, dismiss, distract, dismay, and so on. So I think it's all of that. So a lot of it has been said already in this room by other speakers in previous sessions. Whichever way you look, and we should, of course, look at it, Russian foreign security policy from the usual angles, but we should never forget the absolute fundamental importance of domestic factors, including, I would even say, some personal ones. So that would be my humble short contribution to that part of the debate.
Professor Żurawski, what is your take on this?
I think that to answer this question, first we should ask another one, not about Russian policy, but about Russian politics. That means, what is a real source of the decisions that are taken at Kremlin, whether they are based on the national interest of Russia, whatever the interest is understood in this or that way, or rather, which is my opinion, they are based on the interest of the group that rules in Russia. And this second answer is a correct one. And please remember that Russian government never cared about health and life and welfare of Russian citizens. It's not the base for the decision-making process. They can sacrifice the people without any problem. So the real nature of the game, in my opinion, is that the real target is to sustain the power of Putin and the group of former Siloviks, which so far was stabilized by economic stability created by gas and oil exploitation, which is about to be over or is diminishing. The action in Syria challenged the interests of Sunni monarchies of the Gulf, which are the main producers and managers of prices of oil and gas in the world market. So it is a tremendous risk that was accepted by Kremlin as far as the economic base of the regime is concerned. Why? So my answer is that, remembering that it was not in the previous epoch, it was in 1991 when the Russian political class decided to dissolve the empire, struggling for power at Kremlin. So now, after 16 years of Putin regime, he cannot say that the reduction of the standard of living of Russian population is due to the bad management of the country by the previous government. It is his responsibility. So the only possibility to manage this upcoming internal crisis is to provoke external crises and to say all the shortages are caused by all those imperialists who are plotting against Russia.
So you see, it's maybe defensive was the wrong way to frame this, but a desperation move here almost. Is that?
I think it's the way in which Putin tries to manage the internal situation. The same is about Ukraine. Ukraine was a challenge to the stability, ideological stability of Putin regime in Russia. Successful Ukrainian reforms, successful Georgian reforms.
You're anticipating me. I'm going to get, that's one of my later questions, but yeah, you're
that is a real engine of the policy. It's, well, we are in Poland, so I can say that it's like in 1791 when Poland adopted the first constitution, being surrounded by absolutist monarchs. It cannot survive with proper military protection, not because of the threat, military threat to the neighbors, but because to the ideological threat. Ukraine as a profit-seeking economy and not a rent-seeking economy as it used to be, as a democratic country, as a market-oriented economy, as a country of satisfied people, would undermine the stability of Putin's regime in Russia. Syria is an operation to cover the fact that in strategic sense, Russia lost the war in Ukraine.
So you see a desperation, a defensive move. Ilya Vladimirovich, would you agree with that?
You know, I think that if President Putin would be listening to our panel, he would be
Maybe he is.
Maybe. Maybe. Comrade Colonel, of course, would relay what we are saying here to him, but I think he would be happy because, you know, we are praising him so high, you know, that he's this and that, you know, he has some strategy and approach, and I don't think that's true. Actually, I would rather agree with what was just said, that he is reacting on the events which he does not understand, because that's what scares him. I don't agree that he is scared about the low living standards of Russian people and that they might rebel against this, because he perfectly recognizes that during 90s, for example, it was way worse and they didn't rebel that time, so they most likely will not rebel during his term. I don't see that he sees any fundamental threat to himself, except for one thing. That particular Maidan that happened in Ukraine as before Orange Revolution of 2004, this is a fundamental threat. He never recognizes power of the people. So for him, what was happening means that it's a kind of covert operation created by the West, which he does not understand, which he cannot track, and that's why he is scared that the same thing would happen inside Russia. And what he is trying to do with the aggression in Ukraine, with the annexation of Crimea, is showcase to Russian people that revolution never can be successful. Revolution is always bloodshed, revolution is always chaos, is always poverty, and sometimes even dismembering of the state. He is doing dismembering of Ukrainian state, but his message is that if revolution would happen in Russia, somebody else would do the same thing as we are doing right now for Ukraine. this is a very perverted logic, but I think that's the way how he thinks.
So Putin, the anti-revolutionary, in a sense.
Yes, he's a I would say, is a desperate counter-revolutionary, is a very genuine counter-revolutionary. He's a genuine conservative. Mm-hmm. And starting on this counter-revolutionary wave, he turns himself into a global leader of counter-revolution. And
it's almost like a revival of the Holy Alliance, if you will.
Yes, actually, he tries to bring the situation back to the situation of Cold War, where there was a communist international, now it's a conservative international, and he tries to collect all those bastards across the world, financing them directly, like birds of a flock get together, and the birds of a feather flock together. So that's what he does. And Syria, in this regard, of course, is a bargain point. Because he needs to split Western unity, and he sees this refugees crisis. And what I was witnessing and was watching this very closely, I think that with his media channels like Russia Today, he was playing a lot to increase Western fears on refugees, because Russia Today has been watched by those who are mostly afraid of migration. Of these marginal parts of Western populations, plus his ultra-rightists that he is financing in countries like Hungary, like in France, like in Netherlands. With those people, he increases public fears of those refugees, creates additional political pressure, and then uses it to its own benefit. And the end game is obvious. Of course, you should forget about Crimea, because he realizes that we are pretty much at a dead end with what's happened, and the elites inside Russia are pressuring him, let's do something about it. So that's what he does.
So you see transactional, and Ilya, I would tend to agree. If I were to answer my own question, I think I would see this as primarily as a transactional move by a declining Russia. So somewhere between the transactional and the desperate. It's a desperate attempt to create a bargaining chip, which leads to my next question. This type of behavior by Russia, what we're seeing in Syria particularly, has been described by my good friend Mark Galeotti, who spoke in the very first panel here in another context. He called this geopolitical extortion. Essentially, that Russia is seeking out areas of the world that are important to the West for a whole variety of different reasons. In this case, it's the migration crisis in Europe. And inserting themselves into these crises in creating a situation where the West has to do business with it, has to talk with it, has to bargain with it for things that Russia wants. And I guess my question to the panel would be, how, if we accept this definition, I think it's actually a very elegant way of describing the Russian entry into Syria and what we may expect in the future. If we believe this, how do you deal with a state that is essentially running an international protection racket? Because that's what this adds up to. Mr. Tarasyuk, would you like to jump in on that?
I tend to agree on your description of Russian politics. At the same time, what I would like to say that, what conclusions, what lessons, well, the West has learned after Russian aggression against Georgia in 2008. What lessons the West has learned after aggression against Ukraine and annexation of the Crimea? It seemed to me that Russia learned the lessons in their understanding that no serious response, that they can go ahead and only Putin knows what will be the next move. Will it be in Asia, Africa, or in Latin America? Nobody knows. But from my point of view, the responses were absolutely inadequate. The West, the United West, the United Europe, well, the transatlantic community seemed to be not ready. Well, in the face of this, you know, adventurous policy of Russia. Mm-hmm. And so this lack of adequate response instigated Putin to go further. So, and Syria, to my mind, is not the final stop. And I think that this is partly because of the inadequate transatlantic response and absolutely unreadiness of the European Union with its lack of CFSP and CSDP policy. They are non-existent. So this is the reason why Russia is continuing its adventurous policy.
Robert, would you agree with that as a representative of NATO? Are we first of all, are we looking at an international protection racket, geopolitical extortion, and is Boris Tarasyuk's allegation that the West has been, the response has been inadequate? Is that a fair one?
It's a mild.
Well, I mean, first of all, it is an attractive, particularly in discussions, sort of, you know, to go down the path, this comparison. I mean, you know, Al Capone in the end served time not for his main crimes, but tax evasion, right? But as an international civil servant, I would prefer to avoid going in that direction, calling names. And the second reason, even more serious, is, although first of all, the reason is quite serious for me, is that, you know, at the end of the day, whether it's 85 or 90% of Russians support Putin, so what does it make them, right, if they support this? I think one has to be careful. But I think the word used in the title, right, the gamble, that's an interesting one, because gamble, in my mind, means following that you can gamble because that's the way, that's your tactic, so to speak. But you can prepare yourself for taking that gamble. And I think now it's patently clear that, you know, both the Crimea annexation and, of course, the role Russia has been playing, continues to play, the Eastern Ukraine, has been planned in advance. The same goes for Syria. You cannot start an operation of that nature without some months' preparation, and we have to acknowledge that with all the implications. Why I think this is important? Because in there you can see the dangers and the difficulties for dealing with this. So, kto zawinił, we know, who's to blame, что делать? What should we do is another one. So we already enter into Russian narrative. The problem of dealing with this is that we have certain disadvantages. I mean, obviously, you know, decision-making is of a different nature and so on. But secondly, these decisions are very opaque. They're taken without often the knowledge of even sometimes the closest associates. So in that sense, you know, we should recognize what it is. However, the weakness of the gambling is that, and the opaqueness, which in my view is directly related to the lack of discussion, Russia, can lead to big mistakes, or at least the likelihood of these mistakes increases. And that is, if you want to go down that path, you know, it's easy to criticize Western's response because, well, it's difficult to deal with this kind of situations, but let's also look at the potential structural weaknesses of the gambles themselves.
And along those lines, I would say, I mean, anybody who was at the Wales summit and anybody who was at previous NATO summits, you would see that the difference was just incredibly striking. I remember the way I wrote it up at the time. I said, oh, what a difference 8 years and 2 wars make. Right, because look at the difference between Bucharest and Wales, and I wonder what the difference still we're going to see by the time the Warsaw summit approaches next year. So in defense of the West's response, I would say it may have been inadequate, but it's improving at each step. Professor Żurawski, how would you respond to this?
Yeah. Well, first, 2 general remarks. Policy should be considered, should be watched like a movie and not like a photo. It changes all the time. Yeah? So some things that happen now are the results of the mistakes that have been made by the West in the previous years, starting from the adoption of business as usual policy after Georgian War. Second general remark is that we should not overestimate the intellectual horizons of the colonel of KGB. They are as they are. You know, we should not think that he is an extraordinary...
No, he's a brilliant tactician, but a lousy strategist,
this
in my
is
opinion.
organization where he was taught how to manipulate people and sometimes how to kill them. Yeah? But the problem is that, in my opinion, this policy is based on the disillusion of Putin about Germany. There was a long period of time when Putin built in his imagination the policy of a deep cooperation with Germany, with some success, presenting himself as a man that is very familiar with German culture, who speaks fluently German, and so on. That was a legend of the German at Kremlin, like Holstein-Gottorp-Romanov dynasty and Baltic Germans ruling Russian Empire in the 19th century. So this was the next pattern like that. And on his Crimean speech in March 2014, he appealed directly to the Germans over the head of the government of Germany and was disillusioned. The reaction of Germany to the invasion and annexation of Crimea was contrary to the expectations. And now he's trying to rebuild the links with Germans, but the others. This part of the game is the crisis of immigrants, which is a huge pressure on internal changes in German political scene. And there is an auxiliary area of the game, namely France, which is, again, interested in Mediterranean and which is touched or is under the impact of the crisis in the region. As our guest from Russia said, this policy of collecting all the bastards from the wars, you know, the extreme rightist parties,
Putin turn, we call it.
Especially in the perspective of next elections, both in Germany, where all the reasonable parties are in the governmental coalition, yeah? And they are being politically exhausted by financial crisis of Eurozone and by immigrant crisis and by security crisis or war in Ukraine. The same will be in France, and I think that the real plan of the game is to do what Russia ever does. That means to export destabilization and corruption in order to achieve the goals. That means the political system in Europe that should be transferred, according to Russian plans, to Putin plans, into the Vienna Congress-like concerto of the great powers.
Yeah. Now, you raise a very interesting issue with Germany, because it is one of the big mysteries of this to me, how a man who spent a good chunk of his career as a KGB agent in Germany, who allegedly speaks German and allegedly knows Germany, could not understand that the first territorial annexation by force in Europe since the Second World War wasn't going to freak the Germans out a little bit? I mean, how did he miss that? I mean, it was utterly predictable.
You remember he said that it is the reunification of the nation like the Germans.
He got the metaphor wrong.
Yes, this what shows us his way of thinking, not the reality. Yeah? He was mistaken and he failed the game.
He reads different books than we do.
He reads different books than we do. Ilya, what are your thoughts on this? Ilya Ponomarev.
You know, I'm physicist by training, and I remember during my entrance exams from Moscow State University, I was asked a question: what kind of watch is better? The one which are standing still, or the ones which are getting late 5 minutes a day? And the answer, of course, is those who are standing still, because they twice a day show the correct time. And my point is that even wrong but consistent policy is better than partially right inconsistent policy. And I think that the policy is when you are saying, okay, so we forget about this and that issues, but we cooperate on that and that issues, is an incorrect approach. Because this is something which is fundamentally against the core values of societies. Either you have to pronounce that this is our enemy state, we don't want to make any deals, and then, yes, there might be some tactical cooperation where we do something, or if you take the country as an ally, it should be consistent. And that was the main mistake that West did about Russia. It's either one way or another. Russian elite got very simple message, which was repeated many times during 90s and 2000s, that we will close our eyes on something that you need us to close our eyes, and in return you do us this and that favor. And that's what happened. And that's what's happening now. It's still continuing. And the recent example with Syria, when it's international isolation of Russia, you know, we are against annexation of Crimea, we demand to talk only about how the troops would be withdrawn from eastern Ukraine, but at the same time, when the refugees crisis, Chancellor Merkel calling Obama and asking to arrange a meeting in New York, which US administration, even this mild and peacemaking US administration, was denying consistently for a couple of months. But then it was a strong demand from the Germany side, and then the meeting has happened, and then the Syria bombing has started. What is that? It's just a proof, and it's taken by Russian elite as a 100% vivid proof. Then when it's something which would be really needed, we will renegotiate. And that encourages people to act in whatever way they want to act. And I think this is a fundamental mistake.
So the notion that everything is negotiable, everything is a transaction, there are no values, there are no red lines.
Absolutely. So values are for public relations. Values, they are for manipulating voters. They are not the way how things are being done.
So Russia skipped modernization and went right to postmodernism, it appears in many ways. I'm going to shift gears a little bit and pick up on some things that a couple of people have said about Ukraine, and I'm going to say something that I think will make the gentleman to my left very happy. It's something I've been arguing persistently. Robert heard me make this argument in Brussels a couple of months ago. It's about Ukraine, and I firmly believe this, that Ukraine right now is as strategically important to the West as West Germany was to the West at the end of the Second World War. Not that these situations are exactly the same in any way, shape, or form, but the strategic importance of Ukraine and the importance of integrating Ukraine into the West fully is as important as integrating West Germany into the West was in 1947. And that I believe the best Russia policy the West can have is to have a good Ukraine policy. So, and in this sense, and the reason I say this is because I think this would be the best thing in the world for the Ukrainians, to be embedded fully in the West as a full, secure, prosperous, reformed, democratic Western country that is almost indistinguishable from the country we are all happy to be the guests of right now. But it would also have an amazing effect inside Russia. Ilya, you alluded to this a bit. You said that the example that a democratic Ukraine would set would be an existential threat to this regime, and I think you are right about that. But I think it goes even deeper than that. I think a successfully reformed Western Ukraine, and I say that Western meaning a Ukraine that's in the West, not just Western Ukraine in the West, I think this would... Yes, I do not want to divide Ukraine. It's the last thing I want to do. But this could cause a catharsis in Russia. Losing Ukraine in the Russian mind, I think, would cause a very deep catharsis in Russia. And what we all know, in the West, we go through our catharses all the time. We had one after the Vietnam War, we had one after the Iraq War, and we're always constantly improving as a result of a catharsis, right? Of looking yourself in the eye and saying, we must do better. Russia's never had this. In your opinion, would losing Ukraine cause such a catharsis in Russia, which would be the beginning of positive change inside Russia?
Come on, he should stop being an imperialist and talk in the language of losing Ukraine.
But that's what. But I'm talking in the language of that because that's how it's going to be perceived in Russia, and that would have an effect.
No, that's the way how people think, and that's bad. Because I totally agree with what you are saying. That the most important thing at the moment is to make Ukraine a successful member of international community, a successful member of European Union, a showcase that friendship with the West, affiliation with the West, is a path to success and not a path to poverty and corruption, as Russians think right now. But I would say that even more important thing that making Ukraine part of the West is make Russia part of the West.
But would making Ukraine part of the West create the catharsis in Russia that could lead to that?
Very much so. Very much so. We still have a lot of relatives. And, you know, there are such nuances of state propaganda in Russia. I understand it's like very unpleasant substance, Russian propaganda, so you don't want to sniff it, but it's still different sorts. Originally, we were very clear fighting against fascists in Kiev, against junta. Now there are no such words in Russian media like junta. Now we are saying that we need to help Ukrainians to avoid economic reforms that are inspired by the West. Like every Russian remembers 1990s, and Ukraine is experiencing the same. And, you know, things that are being repeated all the time on the national TV is, you know, how GDP is falling in Ukraine, and how is about corruption in Ukraine, and how IMF is doing in Ukraine, and what is the status of the loans for Ukraine, and whether Ukraine would default or not default. We hear way more about Ukrainian economy than we hear about our own economy, way more. And that's because Kremlin wants Russian people to feel compassion, to compare with 1990s. And West, unfortunately, is repeating the same set of mistakes that was done during 1990s. And I think that from the very beginning, it's the collapse of the Soviet Union and what was seen as the victory in the Cold War, and by the way, it's of course never has been taken as that we lost the Cold War. We stopped the Cold War. That's what we think. We didn't lose the Cold War. You know, we decided to stop it, and we thought that it would be nice, you know, that, you know, people would appreciate this and don't take it like we surrender. We've never surrendered. We just stopped it. And what was needed, you absolutely correctly compare it with Western Germany. It needed some kind of a Marshall Plan. It needs to be a positive plan.
I'm glad you, because this is, yeah, that anticipates where I want to go next.
It needed to be a positive involvement. And right now I'm thinking, okay, so supposedly tomorrow there would be a revolution in Russia. Supposedly tomorrow Putin would go. I'm just thinking how long it would take for us, the new government, to negotiate lifting of the sanctions. Probably it would be the same time as we spent to lift the Jackson-Vanik Amendment, you know, so 25 years.
I'm glad you mentioned the Marshall Plan, Ilya, because I want to bring, and you get to go last on this one, Mr. Tarasyuk, because I want to go to the next issue. I would like to go to Robert Pszczel and Professor Żurawski. What is it going to take for the West to bring Ukraine into the Western community fully? And the second part of that is, does the political will exist to do so? I guess, Robert, you can start if you like.
Well, first, very briefly, this clock analogy. I think, you know, if you have this dilemma, I mean, one solution is happy people don't need to look at the time.
Moderators do.
Moderators, except moderators. But, you know, seriously, whichever way you look at it, and we could probably agree, I hope, that indeed Ukraine is of strategic importance. But having said this, I would certainly prefer that we, the international community, will be offering, I think it is offering, perhaps should be offering more assistance to Ukraine because of Ukraine itself, because of Ukrainian people who need it. And of course, the paradox is the more Ukraine helps itself, the more assistance there will be. That's the truth. Why is it important? Because one of the biggest myths, well, there are many myths that Russia is producing, there's a whole industry of myths in Russia, is that, you know, only power counts, only big countries matter, and only those who can ultimately use force. And if there's another link between the Ukrainian, I want to call it adventure, aggression, and the operation in Syria is that it broke the taboo on the use of military force. But underlying this is a lack of respect for Russia's neighbors, for other countries. And that is, it's not just a myth, it's a policy. And that one has to be posed on for a variety of reasons. One is axiological, because we do have a set of values and we mean that. It matters to us. We may not be perfect, nothing is perfect. But secondly, indeed, because that would in itself also have an extremely sobering effect on the policy which is built on cynicism, on distortion of the facts, and ultimately on the lack of respect, not just for international norms, but for the people both inside Russia and actually living next to it. And I think that's probably, it's the most difficult one. Mm-hmm. But we have to be more confident in ourselves. That's another part.
I think it's also worth noting that Ukrainians, to my knowledge, are the first nation in history to shed blood for the idea of Europe. I don't think any nation has ever shed blood for the idea, for the sake of the idea of Europe. Professor Żurawski, what are your thoughts on this? And I know Ilya wanted to jump in, and I want to give the final word to the former Foreign Minister of Ukraine on this issue.
Well, of course, Ukraine is a key country to decide about the future of this part of Europe, which is perfectly understood in Poland, in the Baltic states, in Romania. I'm not sure it's understood in the same scale in Western Europe and especially in Mediterranean Europe, which is not something that is surprising. It's natural. The problem is that we are all democratic countries and we can agree for an action and pay the costs of the action only to the level that is accepted by the electorate. That's it. And so it's natural that this level is different in different countries. There is a problem with English language to explain that, because in Polish we can distinguish between Russia and Ruś, Russia and Rufinia, if I can say like that. And in that sense, this Putin's idea of Ruski Mir, that was a part of imperial phraseology, was broken by the clear demonstration of the Ukrainian people that their political culture is different than the political culture of Russia.
Regardless of language.
Which is not surprising for the Poles, but which is surprising for the French, for example, and for Russians as well. And to acknowledge this fact, and look, another idea, Russian decision makers and policy planners were mistaken twice while assessing the nature of Ukrainian politics, in 2004 and in 2013-14, during Orange Revolution and during last time Maidan Revolution. They tried to use the social technologies that were successfully used to Russian population, and they failed.
Yes.
Because Ukrainians are not Russians. Yeah? So this is one of the part of the game. The second is Ukraine needs military protection. Whatever reforms will be done in Ukraine, they will be broken by Russia if they are not military protected, because the success of Ukrainian reforms is a threat for Russian internal politics. So Ukraine needs military support. That means weapon.
So we're talking economic support and security guarantees. You have to have, you can't have one without the other.
Of course, but we have in this part of Europe, Poland since 1717, all the time the same question. How to reform the country being threatened by Russia? So you need military protection.
Okay, I want to go to Borys Tarasyuk now. And the words Marshall Plan have come up again and again. And I think everybody uses this historic analogy to say it's what Ukraine needs from the West right now. But if you look at the history of the Marshall Plan, it implied a sacrifice, temporary sacrifice of sovereignty on the part of the Germans and the other Europeans who took the aid. This aid was distributed down to the local level by American administrators. And there was a sacrifice to a degree and for a temporary time of sovereignty. would Ukraine be prepared for that kind of intervention in its internal affairs for the sake of the kind of aid that would be necessary to accomplish this thing we all seem to agree would be a good thing, and that is making sure that Ukraine is successfully reformed in part of the West?
As people in Odessa used to say, это две большие разницы. You know, one cannot historically compare, you know, nowadays Ukraine and Germany after the Second World War. Well, I personally like the idea you just expressed, Brian, about the similarity in strategic importance of Ukraine currently for democratic world and after the Second World War of Germany. I share this view, but it is too good to be truth. I wish this idea be, you know, expressed and shared throughout the Euro-Atlantic community, but it is not the case, unfortunately.
I'm doing my best.
Well, yeah, and I would welcome, and everybody in Ukraine would welcome the massive support. But this is not the case, first of all, currently, and moreover, Ukraine is being the object of politics of some major countries currently, using the situation, a very difficult situation we are in. Let me remind you that Ukraine is fighting alone, militarily, with the third largest military country in the world. We are alone, in fact. We hear debates here and there about the necessity of helping Ukraine, but you know, these debates are ending on the issue of delivering defensive weapons to Ukraine. And Ukraine has to defend, you know, like Ukrainian people were defending during the Revolution of Dignity, European values at the expense of their lives. So not a single country did it. You know, fighting and sacrificing people for the European values. Ukraine did it. You said it rightly. So I wish the Euro-Atlantic community will treat Ukraine adequately to the situation Ukraine is in, and not press Ukraine to implement further and further Minsk arrangements without doing the same with Russia. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I am getting the signal from our organizers that I am instructed to wrap this panel up, which I will do. I'd like to thank each of the panelists. I thought it was an interesting discussion, largely thanks to all of you. So, on that note.